Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.
Good evening, I'm Beth Courtney, president of LPB.
And I'm Shauna Sanford, co-anchor of LPB's Louisiana, the state we're in. After more than a year of campaigning, contentious television ads, and lively debates, the 2015 race for Louisiana's next governor has been decided. Winning by an impressive and improbable landslide, as it has been described, John Bel Edwards defeated David Vitter, becoming the first Democrat to win a statewide election since 2008.
Well, throughout the entire process, LPB has been there, from a live student forum at Southeastern with the candidates to the first televised runoff debate. This evening, LPB partners with the LSU Manship School of Mass Communications to present a look back at the race for governor. We'll hear from campaign managers, political consultants, and journalists as they discuss the candidates' strategies and tactics. We'll also hear from a second panel examining the role that Super PAC money played in the contest. Join us over the next hour for Election 2015 and analysis.
Welcome to our guests and welcome audience. It's so great to have you here. We're looking forward to a great conversation. First-hand account, insider knowledge about what went on behind the scenes of the top 4 gubernatorial campaigns during this election cycle. Co-moderating with me is Elizabeth Crisp. She is a political reporter for the Advocate newspaper. And I know you're excited to get started. Our audience is, and so am I. But first, let me introduce the panel. From the Scott Angel camp, we have Ryan Cross, who served as campaign manager. Next to him, Roy Fletcher, who was the media consultant. From Jay Darden's campaign, we have Jay Vickneer, who served as the campaign manager. Seated next to him is Mary Patricia Ray, who served as communications director for the John Bel Edwards camp, as well as Jared Arsma, who was the media consultant. And for David Vitter, we have Kyle Ruckert, who served as the chief of staff. Welcome, and thank you all so much for being here. And let's just start at the beginning. When you decided that your candidate was the candidate for this race, what were the top 2-3 issues that you said, we're going to have to deal with these things first as we strategize? Ryan, let's start with you.
You know, I think when we started out back in December of last year, January of early this year, and we realized sewing up the geographical base for Scott was one of the most important things we needed to do, that cultural connection that Scott was able to make with the Acadiana, with his home turf, going in and letting guys know that there was a Cajun running for governor. And uniting folks behind that. Second was introducing Scott to the state as a whole. By far, out of all the candidates besides Representative Edwards, Governor-elect Edwards, Scott had the lowest name ID. So we had, outside of his PSC district, outside of St. Martin Parish, where he had served as parish president, and we had to go and introduce him.
There was only one way to win the race, and that was over right tackle, David Vitter. David Vitter was, we recognized, as a fundamental issue in this race. He was the issue in this race, period, simple and out. And our candidate gave us the job of doing the following, and that was to draw distinctions vis-a-vis David Vitter in a way that was not negative.
Jay, you represented the other Republican in the race, so what were the top issues that you all were concerned about from the very beginning? From the very beginning,
being a down ballot candidate, a lieutenant governor, starting Secretary of State before that when we did a race in 2010, you have to kind of reintroduce yourself. And what we did was we wanted to hit on the 3 record-breaking years of tourism, talk about how tourism created jobs for Louisiana, and how Jay's been a great lieutenant governor for the state.
It sounds like also you were really trying to draw a distinction between Jay Darden and Bobby Jindal as well.
You have to, because I mean, as soon as all 4 major candidates got in the race, one of the candidates' major platforms, talking points were, all 3 of these guys are Bobby Jindal. So I mean, you wanted to start from the beginning. You wanted to start from the beginning and saying, we're not there.
Yeah, Mary Patricia Ray.
Well, Ryan hit the nail on the head when he talked about name recognition. I think one of the first polls that we ever ran showed the governor-elect at, I think, 7 or 8% name recognition. And we, of course, all sat around and said, well, this is great. We have so much room to grow. That seems like a long time ago now. One of the other things that we faced that was difficult was just a lot of negativity that bled over from the Senate race and with our candidates' party ID. And so we had to work very hard to make people understand what we understood, which is that we were really facing a completely different set of circumstances. We were running a completely different candidate, that we had this path. The same poll that told us that nobody knew who we were also showed us that we had, a very narrow but a very clear path to winning.
Jared, I think I read that John Bell Edwards was the longest of the long shots.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think for me, the biggest challenge, I think it was the most obvious. He's a Democrat running in a state and a time where nobody believes a Democrat can win statewide. And, I mean, we heard that not from Republicans. We heard that from diehard Democrats. Mm-hmm. People who, went to the wall for Senator Landrieu, a year earlier, just telling us, I bled too much for Mary, I can't do anything for John Bell, kind of thing. They just didn't think it was possible. In fact, to the point where some people wanted John Bell out of the race, because if they were an anybody but Senator Vitter supporter, they felt like all the governor-elect was going to do was put Senator Vitter into a runoff that he couldn't lose against the Democrat. But for me, I always felt like, because his profile and his personal story was so strong, and I personally felt like all the other campaigns were going to focus so much on public policy and things like that, nobody was going to focus heavily on personal bio and a personal story. I always kind of felt like people won't start believing that this guy can win until they start seeing his story out there and hearing from their friends saying, who is this guy? This guy's got an impressive background. I've never heard of this guy.
Kyle, so interesting. I want to get your perspective, because your candidate came in as the projected frontrunner for the Republican Party. So what was the story there? What were the issues that you were grappling with from the very beginning?
Well, thank you. From the very beginning, I guess there was a number of things as transitioning from a Senate campaign, a Washington-based, to the Louisiana gubernatorial race was obviously, part of the transition. Talking about the issues, we decided early on we were going to come up with a plan, which you may have heard David talk about a few times, and we started rolling that out chapter by chapter in April, and thought it was important to get those, and also in many of them show a distinction between Governor Jindal, as Jay mentioned. That was kind of an early polling, as we wanted to show we were Louisiana based, and kind of we knew our opponents would talk about Washington, but David did 380 town halls. He does all the teletown halls. He gets around the state. He lives here. So we tried to be as Louisiana-centric as possible, while obviously keeping a close eye on our Republican rivals, as they had room to grow, as I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of curious. We saw this election kind of had a slow simmer. At what point did any of you have to kind of shift strategies?
Vitter had a poor summer. And then we got to the end of August, and that's when all hell broke loose. But we never had to shift strategy until all hell broke loose, and we got about a couple of mil dropped on us. I don't know. He can tell us how much, but that's when we actually had to answer a Vitter attack on the Obama thing, which we did, and it stopped our slide. Because it did cost us about 3 or 4 points during September, and it stopped our slide, and that's when we changed strategies to some extent. But we never got off of what we intended to do, and at the end, the numbers started popping right back up, and I mean, we came close. I mean, what can you say?
Mary Patricia, I know y'all had a very obvious time when the campaign had to shift, because the governor-elect managed to kind of fly a little under the radar while the Republicans were duking it out with each other. Obviously, after the primary, I'm sure that there was a big shift in strategy.
We tried to maintain the same message throughout, and I think that our candidate spent almost 2 years traveling the state, shaking hands, kissing babies, because we couldn't raise any money, and it just wasn't a good use of his time to try to spend hours on the phone raising money or trying to throw big events. It was better to just try to meet every voter that we could for a long time. So then after that, I would say one big strategy shift was that there was a time when we had to make our TV budget basically, or we had to reconsider what we were doing. And so we refocused on fundraising. We had an incredibly hardworking candidate who just somehow pulled a rabbit out of a hat when it came to raising money. But yeah, we had Jared's now infamous commercial in the I won't say in the can, but in the back of our minds for a long time. We saw exactly what was described, which was Senator Vitter's favorability numbers were trending slightly up. And we know that's what would precede an actual move in the numbers. And so for better or for worse, decided to pull the trigger.
Before all of that, I think we were fortunate to fly under the radar because, as Roy pointed out, it was essentially a Republican primary. Mm-hmm. And to our benefit, that got chippy probably is an understatement, but it got chippy between the three of them, which we had always felt like had to be a part of John Bell's path. We were fortunate that our strategy didn't have to change at all in the primary. All the ads that we rolled out in the order that we were hoping to roll them out. And the only time that there was any consideration of changing that strategy was when the Republican Governors Association first started attacking us, and the thought was given, okay, well, Governor Jindal is very unpopular, has close ties to this organization. Do we go after him and make this is just Bobby Jindal coming after a governor-elect Edwards and that kind of thing? But the intent of that ad was it was all about tying him to President Obama. That was not an ad intended to hurt John Bell in among the African American base. And the ad that was up next for us was the West Point Honor Code ad, and we knew that white voters responded. I mean, everyone responded very, very well to the West Point part of his biography, and so we felt like. We kind of debated whether we do something different at that point or not, but ultimately made the decision, especially rather than us put on another ad that looks like all the other attack ads that are flying around with still pictures of Governor Jindal and this and that, let's just go with the non-response response.
And Kyle, I know you were kind of in a similar situation. We did see a shift in, obviously, strategy. Some people have speculated that if Senator Vitter had come out with the ad that came out near the end where he's apologizing, which I think was a really effective ad. Some people have speculated that perhaps if he had come out with that in August, then that would have taken that issue more off the table because it would have been addressed.
I don't think that would have. I don't think that Jared and Mayor Patricia would have said, okay, well, they already talked about that. We're not going to go there. Or the trial lawyers would have said, wait, Vitter said that. We'll take a 20-second time out. So, we made the best decision and thought that was the time. I think their ad doing that gave us a little bit of an angle where there was some angle where people were seeing some forgiveness. We doubled down with it with the Willie ad, which played well in North Louisiana, and as others were saying, we saw David's image going up. It ended up being overall had a positive unfave by the end of the campaign.
And Jake, when the negative ads came out against your candidate, how did he actually respond? I mean, I know in debates and forums he talked about it, he addressed it, but other than that, how did he respond?
Well, I think the first time we went up on an ad, we kept getting asked, when are you going to respond? When are you going to respond? And you'd say, look, it's not that easy. I can't tell over 1 million voters that what he's saying about Jay isn't true. Well, so we had to kind of adjust our messages in TV to kind of continue our path of saying that you could trust me. I'm the honest politician in this race, and by the way, everything being thrown at me is a lie. So that's kind of where that had to shift when the negative attacks started coming towards us. Now, I do agree with Kyle, going back to with his ad. At what point you air it, it doesn't matter. They still would have had to deal with that the whole campaign through. I kind of heard that one of the first blows actually came from us during the August WRKF forum, where someone asked, "What's the difference between you and Senator Vitter?" And of course, that was answered when it came out prostitution. But you got to be prepared. But you can, again, only do so much with what you have. And if we didn't do it on TV, we had to do it on the internet.
Jared, what were the conversations like between you and John Bell about when you were going to go negative and how negative you were going to go as you were watching all of this happen?
I think watching all of that happen, for me, there was right before the primary concluded, there was a poll that was going around, and it was testing issues to use against John Bell, and he called.
There were 13 of them.
He called me and started giving me a rundown that this poll's going around and he was kind of like, look, I mean, there is no way we can respond to all this stuff. I mean, we always knew when they came after us, it was going to be all kinds of stuff, but we didn't know exactly what. It's kind of left to your imagination, but. He and I kind of had the conversation, and it was kind of at his initiative to say, we need to look at doing something to start the primary to basically say, look, they're just going to say all the same type of stuff they were saying about Jay and Scott, that type of thing, to sort of set the stage to just try to dismiss all the attacks if you can in a way and try to diffuse them. And I got off the phone with him and called somebody else who a trusted advisor of mine who had actually gotten the poll. And he just was kind of laughing about it and said, I was on the phone with this young guy doing the poll, and he's a John Bell supporter, and in the middle of it he said, you know this is all BS, right? And the kid kind of laughed and said, his response was, this is as hard on me to read as it is on you to listen, sir. And so he and I we concluded our conversation with him kind of saying, yeah, you just got to come out of the gate and just say, dismiss all of this.
Brian was just shaking his head to a lot of what you were saying there. What was it like inside your camp?
We got hit. The two biggest hits that came against us was where they tied us to President Obama and where they labeled it Scott's sinkhole. Right. A lot of people asked us on the campaign trail, how long did it take you to take your shovel and dig the sinkhole out? But it was something that was very unique in that the Fund for Louisiana's Future was able to take this issue and in 30 seconds convey a message that people kind of looked at and they kind of shook their head. We didn't see it pop up too much, not as much as the President Obama hit, but people understood it, they grasped it. To explain why it was false, why it was a lie, took me sitting down with you 10 minutes. Elizabeth, I think you and I had multiple conversations about the intricacies of Louisiana state law and about Scott running for the Public Service Commission that Roy and I couldn't write necessarily in a 30-second script and convey to someone, but you were getting asked.
We didn't have the money at the time to answer both of them anyway. So I said, okay, that one's hurting us, that one's not. Let's take that one and answer.
Right.
So we took Obama, we answered it, and it stopped our slide.
Kyle, when that negative ad came out, take us inside the Vitter camp. What happened? What were the conversations?
You're talking about which one?
Patriots over prostitutes. Prostitutes over patriots. Got it.
Yeah, I was going to say there were a lot of negative ads, but you got to specify. We saw and we were trying to figure out, was it just for the LSU game? Was it something that they're running? Because they obviously tried to make it as big of an earned media splash as possible that Friday before early voting. And, we were looking at kind of what our next spot was at the time. And, I would say that, they ran a very disciplined campaign. We saw early on that once we got into the runoff, their image among swing voters was 44-11, and that's just, that had to be changed. So that's why we started off with some negatives. But when they did that, we were like, well, maybe we can this is the time to go with the redemption ad. And so that's when we, kind of went with that and got a really, positive response. Our image continued to grow. Our numbers, were starting to move. So I think that was the right call at the time.
You sound very cool, calm, and collected. Was it like that? Was it a hit? Was it a sting? Because, take us inside.
Yeah, it was definitely a sting. We were trying to figure out exactly it was, 15 years ago. So, or when was the vote? It was, so it was, we're trying to kind of figure out, well, what was the vote? What was the, so we knew obviously of the general hit, and so we were doing, like everybody, doing our research and kind of figuring everything out.
Yeah.
Seems kind of like a natural transition, talking about negative ads, endorsements in the race. We saw Scott Angel did not ever come out and endorse anybody. Jay Darden actually crossed party lines to come out and endorse the governor-elect. I guess, Kyle, were you surprised by their positions, and did you think that even after the negative ads, that the Republican Party would all kind of come together and...
No, you kind of could feel early on that wasn't kind of, the kumbaya wasn't exactly going to occur. The other thing, we had a short sprint. We had 28 days, so just that amount of time. And look, at the end of the day, endorsements don't win or lose races. It's the campaigns and the actual candidates. So they got some good earned media out of it.
And I know, Jay, you actually went to Senator Vitter's campaign after the primary. Were you surprised to see the lieutenant governor come out and cross party lines to endorse?
I was 50-50. I thought there was a chance that he could endorse, and I thought there was a chance that he might just sit out. And he said he felt he had to answer his supporters in some way, and if that's what he wanted to do, that's his decision. And that's what he told me. I said, I got to support Senator Vitter in this runoff, and he said, if that's what you got to do, that's what you got to do.
I'm really curious because the media played such an important role. I mean, your candidate responded to the negative attacks via the media. Kyle, I'm curious to know, your candidate wasn't always really readily available to the media until the runoff, and he didn't participate in a lot of debates. Was that a part of your strategic plan, and if so, why?
A lot of the questions that we were getting weren't exactly on the policy-based things that we've been trying to talk about. And then we went to we went to 35 or so forums from January until the runoff. Were completely accessible, had a number of different press availabilities. Some chose to come, some didn't.
But that all changed during the runoff. He became available. We started getting, information on where he was going to be. None of that during the primary.
Yeah, part of that was that we were getting hit from some of our Republican opponents for being in Washington, doing our job or not doing our job, and so there was kind of, and the press frankly chose to cover whichever kind of side that they wanted on that, and once we got into the runoff. That was less of an issue, frankly, than it was once it was, Republican versus Democrat.
As someone, like you had mentioned, went from Team Darden to Team Vitter, if you ask me what is the biggest difference you noticed, basically I went from the team with probably the media darling throughout. There was never... When we didn't get the Times Picayune union endorsement, that was a little bit of a shock. Jay has always been a fan of media. He can always pick up an endorsement. Papers really seem to really like his honesty. So then you shift over to the Senator Vitter's campaign, and I think my first talk with a reporter, I went on to say, why I believe that Senator Vitter would be a good choice for Louisiana. Yeah, that didn't make it. It didn't get in the paper at all. And just one of my a personal anecdote of just you could tell that the media is not the biggest fan.
We always felt an extreme responsibility that if our candidate was disliked, or we felt they were disliked by a particular media outlet or weren't treated fairly by a particular media outlet, that it was our job to address it. And my day job is as a lobbyist, so I know that a lot of times you catch more flies with honey. Sometimes you don't. But the first attempt by our campaign when we felt like we were not treated fairly was to express that, to ask for some kind of remediation rather than, retracting. And I feel that, obviously we had a different candidate who wasn't as well known. Being available was an obviously good strategy for our candidate.
Ryan, you get the last word.
I think when it came to handling with the media during the race, we had great run-ins every single time. Scott loved talking to reporters. I loved, getting the stories run, and we always felt like we were treated fairly. The hardest time I think Roy and I had was in getting coverage of our momentum. I think part of it was, and I'm sure Mayor Patricia and Jerry can attest to this, no one believed it. Back in July when Vern Kennedy ran his first poll that said, Scott's coming. everybody kind of laughed, and I know the Vitter campaign called Vern, his polling was from Fantasyland, and at the time it was completely reasonable for someone when you had all of these public polls that showed, the serious Vitter momentum and that Scott and Jay were kind of lagging far behind. It made sense to say, oh, that poll's just an outlier. Now we know that he was one of the more closer predictors of the race. But in trying to pitch stories to the various media outlets and to the reporters saying, look, Scott's coming, and even going into the final week, polls coming out saying we were at 10%, and Roy and I, or 7, one of them had us as low as 7, and Roy would talk. Roy and I would talk every single night, probably the last conversation we had before we went to sleep even before his wife and my fiance. We'd talk to each other for probably an hour, and we would just sit back and go, come on, we know we're somewhere around 20%. We know we have a shot at this. And
we couldn't get it out.
And we couldn't get it out there.
Yeah, it was tough. But we had to break through. And it cost us some money. It cost, and that was the critical issue for us at the last week, 10 days of the campaign, was that we were dark in New Orleans, and finally, the last 3 days we got to go, this is a third of the state that we were dark in that media market. And that probably cost us $200,000. That one poll that said we were at 7 probably cost us that much money.
Yeah.
And it's very frustrating.
Yeah, wow. Well, I'll tell you what's frustrating. We are out of time. We have to cut this off. I wish we had more time. You all did not disappoint. Thank you so very much for your time and for the insight. Ryan Cross, Roy Fletcher, Jay Vicknair, Mary Patricia Ray, Jared Arsma, and Kyle Ruckert. Thank you all, and thank you, audience. Let's give everybody a round of applause. And thank you, Elizabeth. This was fun.
We have a panel of experts, political strategists, and journalists to explore super PACs, their use in this campaign, and what the future might hold. Joel DeGrotto, on my far left, is the executive director for the Fund for Louisiana's Future, a super PAC that supported David Vitter's campaign for governor. The Center for Public Integrity reports it spent almost $3.2 million on television ads advocating Mr. Vitter's election. Previously, Joel managed U.S. Senator Bill Cassidy's 2014 campaign and had been Senator Vitter's communication director. Trey Orso is the chairperson of Gumbo PAC, which spent, according to the Center for Public Integrity, $1.2 million at least on television ads to oppose David Vitter. Trey is a partner with the Orso Baychok political consulting firm and was executive director of the Louisiana Democratic Party. 2 journalists will lead this discussion. Melinda DeLotte here is Capitol correspondent for the Associated Press, and Julia O'Donohue is state politics reporter for the Times-Picayune-NOLA.com. Melinda will start the discussion.
Well, thank you all for participating in this. I appreciate it. I guess since super PACs are so new to Louisiana, let's start with kind of an easy question, I think, after the first cycle of this, which is, in what ways do you think super PACs are effective, and in which ways do you think they're ineffective as campaign funding devices and in terms of helps for campaigns?
Well, I'll begin. Thank you for having me. They're obviously effective the way the law allows us to set them up now, because we can accept unlimited contributions. So, if people want to come in and they can only give $5,000 to a statewide campaign, but they support the activities of the super PAC, they can give us literally an unlimited amount of money. So that really is a brave new world in politics here in Louisiana, something new. As far as their ineffectiveness, I really don't know. I mean, the biggest thing for me is I kind of isolated myself the last several months, so just a lack of communication with the campaigns or the state party, particularly in the runoff. Maybe there was a lot of misinformation, or just a lack of communication makes it a little bit difficult, because we were trying to play it straight. So that was probably the biggest downfall, but the biggest uptick of it is the amount of money that you can raise in a very short time.
Can you all explain to the audience and people who might watch this at home, what changed that allows you to give unlimited donations?
But out of Citizens United, super PACs sort of became the term for these independent expenditure organizations. In Louisiana, the Fund for Louisiana Future was set up, there were legal actions, I guess, against the board, with the Board of Ethics or some things that I'm not 100% certain on the weeds, but we won in court to not be capped at independent expenditures receiving a maximum of $100,000. The federal law and the federal precedent, I guess, was looked to as superior to what the state election committee, or whatever the proper terminology of that agency is, was trying to cap those donations. And so that's kind of how we got here.
The lawsuit that the Fund for Louisiana's Future won against the State Ethics Board is what enabled us to form Gumbo Pack and raise and spend unlimited monies.
Right. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So
Well,
that
does bring us to a question, which is Senator Vitter was obviously the driving force behind allowing the raising of unlimited donations for super PACs, and it seemed as though in some ways that came back to bite him more than anybody else in this. Do you see that way?
I think that you have to sort of look at it in a holistic view. And if he didn't drive it as part of what we believed, if he wasn't driving behind that, then maybe somebody else would have done it. Or look, there was clearly, and it became very, very clear through the course of the race, a very organized soft money effort against Senator Vitter. And if it wasn't through these vehicles, I'm pretty sure motivated people with money to spend would have found other vehicles. That's my editorial comment on it. So I'm not necessarily sure that he sort of made, I think that's a nice media narrative, but I'm not necessarily sure that's pragmatic in the sense that if you have two big opposing forces with a lot of financing, they were going to find a way.
In the work that we do around the country, in different states, we've worked for 12 years in Maine, for instance, and they have clean elections in Maine, so a state Senate candidate gets all of about $18,000 to run their Senate race. Well, everybody pours the money through the caucus program and PACs. So, I mean, as walls are erected to keep money out of the political process, people find ways to get the money in. It's just the way it is.
It's like water.
Yeah.
No matter how you direct the water, it's going to seep through.
That's right.
Well, in terms of the kind of the firewalls, y'all are not allowed to coordinate with candidates. So walk us through how you ensure that doesn't happen, that you don't coordinate with candidates, but yet you have a message that helps or hurts the candidate you're trying to support or oppose. How do you maintain that division?
Can I take this one first?
Absolutely.
I feel like, y'all were set up in a sort of way that was good because it was anybody but Vitter, right? So with me, obviously, we felt like there was all these entities against Vitter, and I was the blitzing defense or the cavalry or whatever it needed to be at whatever time. Very much early on, when I finished the campaign with Dr. Cassidy, I made a decision, probably because I am married to an attorney and she freaked me out, to basically be a man with a beard in a cave. I stopped talking to everybody who was even remotely associated with back to the campaign on the other side, and I only talked to my team of consultants and people that were completely working on the Fund for Louisiana's Future. So what are the challenges? Well, I have to basically discover things that I think the campaign's doing while you guys are discovering it. I have to try to see if things that are happening in media narratives are things that I'm supposed to sort of analyze and react to or ignore. I set up our super PAC to be like its own campaign. We had our own pollster, we did our own research, and I felt like that freed me to make decisions that were informed and independent because I didn't want to even begin going down that trail.
So did you take it to the point where you didn't, obviously you are friends with people who are working on the campaign, and you've known those people for a long time because you worked for Senator Vitter in his Senate office. So did you shut down all communication with those people? Did you still see them for coffee, or did you just stop talking?
I made a ridiculously overarching concerted effort to not even talk to people.
Why go with someone like you to run the super PAC when he could have picked someone who doesn't have as many direct ties? Or, I'm sorry, maybe he's not picking them. When the super PAC picks someone. You know what I'm saying? Were you ever worried about the optics on the situation of the super PAC looking like it's coordinating with the campaign, given your relationship with the senator?
I was offered the job by the president of the Super PAC, Charlie Spees, probably because there is at least innate benefits to having someone who sort of knows how they think, even though you can't talk to them.
So how do you cultivate donors? Do you basically go to the same list of people who are supporting the candidate that you are supporting? Do you come up with your own list? And how many times do you go back to the same well?
I don't know. I mean, for us, there were a time, I think we filed a 90-day report over the summer where we had raised $12,000 in 90 days. And so for us, there were times when there wasn't a whole lot going on, and particularly from the fundraising. But part of what my goal was when I formed Gumbo PAC back in April was, to build a mechanism so that if the race shifted and people decided they wanted to fund it, we would have it there, because you just can't do these things overnight. It takes you a while to get going. Like Joel, I hired a team of consultants, pollsters, media guys, digital guys. And then, we tried to chip away through earned media, social media, and everything else at just this aura of inevitability. When we started, people just thought we were nuts. And Senator Vitter has a reputation of being rough and tumble, and it doesn't take kindly to people that don't agree with his politics. We thought initially when we started the PAC that we would be able to tap into supporters of not only John Bell Edwards, Governor-elect Edwards' campaign, but also of the Darden and Angel supporters who may have seen it in their interest to help us raise money to go after Vitter. But that never really materialized. We had lots of meetings and lots of promises and lots of big talk, but really no big checks. Every dollar in and every dollar out, we report just like the campaigns do. And so there are a lot of people, particularly business people, who said, well, if we give you 10,000 or 50,000 or 1,000, they're going to check the reports. And even if by some off chance Senator Vitter doesn't win the governor's race, he's still going to be in the Senate. And so there was a significant intimidation factor for potential donors to the PAC.
I have to say, just as like a side note, which is so interesting for me, because just coming off Cassidy Landrieu, we felt like the exact same thing, that donors, business folks were so afraid to cross Senator Landrieu that even though they were going to, quote, vote for us, they didn't want a paper trail. It's so interesting to hear that from, it's kind of Twilight Zone.
I was wondering what y'all thought was the most effective thing that each of your super PACs did during the campaign.
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Well, what I really, begrudging respect, obviously, I liked your slow burn strategy overall. You might have thought, or maybe the chattering class was sort of, you thought snickering that you guys weren't putting in big reports, but at least I can speak for us at the fund. We watched and we were very aware and trying to figure out when or if this long fuse was going to go faster. And so I think that the way that you sort of just were under the radar of most everybody else, kind of similar to how John Bell performed very well, with the same sort of tactic, just keeping the head down and never sort of stopping. I just think from a meta perspective, I thought it was very well done, very organized.
Thank you. Obviously, the fund did a great job of suppressing Scott Angel and Jay Darden. I mean, every time, when Scott started moving, they came in and knocked him down. And then when Jay started moving a little bit, it seemed, a little bit, they came in and whacked him down too. And I think that although it did create hard feelings on the behalf of those Republicans, they had to do it. I mean, in other words, you got to get into the runoff to have a chance to win. So I don't think that they really had many other cards to play, but to suppress the votes of those two guys.
But it didn't just create hard feelings; it created sound bites that you then used in the runoff.
Well, it did. Yeah.
But I mean, to defend myself a little bit, we really, when this race started, we didn't know how well John Bell was going to poll, or if he was going. So we actually we were looking at, we have to entertain the debate of sort of submarine tactics to actually help John Bell. That became very clear that wasn't going to be a problem. And so once that happened, we saw it upon ourselves to be Vitter's blitzing defense, and that's what we had to do.
on the subject of messaging, how do you choose a message, and who is the sounding board? I mean, I understand when you're working for a campaign, you know, ultimately the candidate has to sign off on something, but y'all are doing things that can help the candidate you're supporting and sometimes can backfire on the candidate you're supporting. So how do you figure out and devise a message, and who's the sounding board for that?
For me, it was fairly easy because Gumbo Pack essentially was myself and a team of political professionals that I assembled. And so we were our sounding board. For us, it was easy because everything we were going to do was anti-Vitter, right? And so through polling and other research, we just made determinations of what we thought would be the best message, depending on how much money we had at the time. In the runoff, when we were much better funded, our anti-Vitter message, if you go and look at all the ads that we did in the runoff, were targeted 99% specifically at Jay Darden and Scott Angel voters. We weren't talking to David Vitter voters. We didn't need to talk to Governor-elect Edwards voters. We wanted to talk to the Angel, Darden voters because our initial polling showed that we were getting about half of those were willing to vote for John Bell Edwards. And throughout the rest of the runoff, we were trying to give these Republican-leaning voters, many of whom are Democrat registered but voted Republican, basically permission to vote for John Bell Edwards.
And then Joel, the same question for you. How did you, since you had a specific candidate you were supporting, it seemed as though that might be a trickier line to walk because you don't want to hurt the candidate in any way, but you have no way to make sure what you're doing is okay to the candidate.
No, there was a lot of times where we were like, well, we hope that they're gonna see what we're doing and understand what we're seeing. But I mean, we always tried to set it up as if we were a second campaign, and we were always taking polls and doing research and doing oppo, and based on where things were happening in the polls and where our indicators were moving that were concerns, that's where we focused, and that's how we picked the messages. But very similarly, we were on our own, we were on an island, and you know, it basically just came down to, you know, a small group of us just studying, talking it through.
And the other thing, really, in the minute details, you know, when you're buying all this television, your media buyers, we're getting comps every day. And so we're seeing how much he's buying in every market, and he's watching how much we're buying in every market, and we're seeing how much the campaign is buying in every market. And every day, your buyers are getting these comparative rates, and I mean, how much money, the comps. And so every day, that was a big discussion. We're trying to see why is Joel buying this much TV here, or the RGA's buying there, and
that's what really I geeked out on. Was every at the end of the day, my media buyer would send us the comp report, and I'd be like, wait, what? Yeah. I thought their funding report only said they had this much money, but how come they're just through this many points? And then I'd scramble, and then I'd try to figure out where, like, it was very interesting to try to read your opponent's move just based on their buying patterns, which is probably not the best thing to do.
But it is, we never, even though we spent nearly $3 million in the runoff on TV, we never bought Shreveport because we were targeting parts of the state where Darden and Angel did best, because as I mentioned, we were communicating directly to their voters. Vitter did best in Northwest Louisiana in the Shreveport media market, so we thought there was less opportunity for us to communicate with Darden and Angel voters, and the cost per point in Shreveport is outrageous. And so we were thinking to pay that much per point, talking to an electorate that we didn't think was that beneficial to us for what our goals were. We never bought, and we were hoping, well, God, I mean, I assume the campaign sees that we're not buying Shreveport, though. And they bought very light in Alexandria. And I was like, why are they buying so light in Alexandria? So we were trying to buy a little bit more in Alexandria.
It's really funny because I was like, why is both John Bell's campaign and Gumbo Pack going big in Alexandria? And then it kind of dawned on me that there's spillover into Lafayette from Alexandria. So I kind of figured out what I thought y'all were doing. Also, it seemed like Jay overperformed there in the primary.
He did well,
so that was, it started to click for me very quickly. I will say for us, we kept our presence in Shreveport in North Louisiana because our idea was sort of invoking President Obama's electoral strategy was if we can increase gains in Vitter country, then it's less of a zero-sum game for us to fight down south. Right. So that was a little bit of what we were trying to do with the same probably group of voters.
Right.
So were you you also targeting Darden and Angel voters like
I mean,
he
for me, it was less those specific voters because after the Cassidy experience, I kind of clicked for me that while it's easy to talk about that when you're sort of rehashing, voters don't have a sewn identity on them. I'm now Darden for life or Angel for life. You try to figure out what messages got them over. And then really it's just for us, it was trying to pull what should have been, moderate Democrats, independents who had conservative lean, and Republicans back over to David with the messaging that we thought could show a distinction between what Vitter's leadership would look like versus John Bell's. That was really, that was sort of the big picture sort of way we tried to approach it. Because again, we're not selling a candidate. We were kind of blitzing defense. We were trying to drive a wedge.
To what extent did you think character issues and specifically prostitution were going to be something you would have to address?
My goal was to make the election, as much about David Vitter as possible all the way to the end, from beginning to end. And as Joel mentioned, kind of the slow burn over the summer, through social media networks, which we were spending money on, we were trying to create this conversation of people talking about the prostitution scandal, talking about David Vitter and his values or whatever we wanted to frame it as. By the end of the summer, we were reaching anywhere from 40 to 60,000 people a day just on our Facebook page. And every time something came up, we would post it and then we would boost it. You can advertise, obviously, and spend money on Facebook, and it would spread like wildfire. People share and talk. And I think what that did over the summer is it let people who were not fans of David Vitter realize that they weren't alone, that there were other people out there, and share information and create a conversation, because at the beginning of the year, it was a coronation. Nobody even thought anything would happen besides him getting elected. And so we tried over the summer, if nothing else, just to create kind of a insurgent campaign and create a safe place where anti-Vitter voices could go to share thoughts and share ideas.
Well, and Joel, for you on that topic, you're obviously in a tricky position because you have a candidate you are supporting who has no interest in talking about a prostitution scandal and has done everything at that point to sort of dodge any discussion of it.
I don't think a third-party group should be talking about that, even if it's trying to be a response or a positive. The best communicator is the candidate for those types of leadership, image, personality issues. Yeah, sure, you could have a really slick surrogate kind of thing, but I still feel like with something that raw and personal, I don't think a third-party group could ever do that effectively. And so we decided that another thing that I think we didn't talk about, but it was something that drove what I did a lot, was since you can't coordinate, you have to make it clear to everybody publicly what your lane is, so that your campaign hopefully knows that you're staying in your lane, you're giving them that stability, that consistency, so that they can be free to make audibles that they need to do. So I very early on just decided, I was like, my lane is XYZ. I want everybody to just know it publicly.
What was your lane?
My lane was to destroy anybody who was going to go try to take out David in the polls.
So Jay and Scott.
Yeah, so that was our thought process behind it. But very quickly we just decided that we need to give comfort to the other side that we're going to be in this lane to free them up for everything else. And then we stuck to what we needed to do. And again, in the beginning, Scott and Jay were kind of like tied in the polling. So we couldn't just attack one because there was this sort of balance beam I was worried about. If I push on one end, the other one goes up. If I push on, so we were hitting both of them at the same time. Then once Jay started to sort of separate downward from Scott, we just hit Scott. But then after we were maybe a little too effective because then Jay started to climb back up. So then we had, it was kind of like every week we had to reassess who are we beating up this week.
Like whack-a-mole?
Whack-a-mole.
Whack-a-mole.
That's what I was thinking, right?
But it was like whack-a-mole on a balance beam.
At what point did you realize that maybe you needed to be doing whack-a-mole at John Bell? Like, you're whack-a-moling over here.
I'm glad you asked that, because this is what has kept me up for a couple nights post the election, is what could I have done differently? And going into the last week of the primary, the undecideds were still, at least in our polls, fluctuating like 17, 15, maybe like a couple days before the election it was 11. That's still way too high, right? So and everything in my bones wanted to start telling people how not conservative John Bel Edwards is. But I couldn't, because if 2-1 of those undecideds broke to one of the other two Republicans, David's not in the runoff. So I had to continue to basically throw a blanket on top of the other two Republicans.
But the RGA did come in 2 weeks out on the 10th, and they started and they ran about $1 million in the last 2 weeks, which I really thought was a brilliant move on their part, because he was stuck having to defend the flank to keep Darden and Angel from making the runoff. Meanwhile, Governor-elect Edwards was just rolling right along. Nobody said a word about him because everybody knew from day one Senator Vitter wanted John Bel in the runoff, and John Bel wanted Senator Vitter in the runoff. And so they got exactly what they wanted. It's not the outcome that a lot of people suspected at the time. But when the RGA came in and started attacking Governor-elect Edwards, I thought it was a really smart move, and I'm just glad they didn't do it before. It basically gave them a 2, because they knew Vitter's numbers had gone upside down, his internals on favorability and values and trustworthiness, and all those things had flipped around mid-September. And I think they rightly knew that in a 28-day period, it would be almost impossible to not only demonize John Bel Edwards, but to also resurrect Senator Vitter at the same time, because there's not a lot of time. And so, people don't remember that, but it was actually 6 weeks of ads, because they started 2 weeks before and all the way
right before October 23rd, right?
That's right.
Yeah, we remember.
Yeah, I remember, right.
In terms of the strategy to try and tie John Bel Edwards to President Obama, that was a strategy that had been used very effectively in the Senate race that you worked on, obviously.
You're welcome.
Was there a time where you thought, okay, this isn't working, maybe I need to change my approach in the runoff? Because it seemed as though that was a consistent...
Well, look, it's easy, I think, in hindsight to say, that wasn't working. But when you looked at least in our polling, please correct me if you see it differently, when you looked in our polling, the only way to sort of... we had such a short time window, 28 days, that the only way to, aggressively separate the amount of white Republican vote and white Democrat vote we needed off was to hang the very unpopular president around John Bel. I mean, yes, Governor Jindal actually had a lower image rating than John Bel, and folks like to acknowledge that, but we basically had to rush to try to at least get the president, whose image rating's bad, wrapped around John Bel, who did such an effective job when nobody was looking, saying he was basically a Republican.
I still am curious, particularly for you, Joel, when you knew that Governor-elect Edwards really looked like he was in a position to win the race. Because I think from our side, and I'll speak just for me personally, it's these polls keep coming out, right? But I'm hearing from people like Mike Henderson or people who have done a lot more work around this stuff. Well, it's early. We're many weeks out from a runoff. You can't poll about a runoff in September and actually expect that to be what's, clearly the RGA about 2 weeks out from the primary was there's a problem here. Is that when y'all also thought there might be something going on?
Well, I think that you can't have a standard rule of thumb. Every election's different, specifically in this one, which very quickly became a referendum on David Vitter, as if he were running for re-election of governor. That all being said, I think you look for some sort of indicators in the wilderness. And for us, when we were seeing the consistency, poll after poll in our internals of his image just either flatline bad or actually worse, right before the primary was a big red flag that we needed to be worried about, because I think everybody coming off of Cassidy Landry assumed there would be a snapback. There would be people who flirted with the other guys, but they're going to come back and be a Republican to vote for the Republican. And if you looked on, on October 23rd, 57% of the state voted for a Republican, one of the three combined. So that's part of your mentality is you have to base things off of experience, knowing that every race is also different. And so you're hoping that there will be the snapback. And I think that everybody sort of misjudged.
Yeah, we polled right before the primary, the week of the primary, and at that point we saw where John Bel's numbers were among white voters and where Vitter's numbers were among white, and we were like, this is pretty crazy. We have a chance here. And then we polled again the week after, and we polled a lot at the end. And with 2 weeks to go, we had them virtually tied, 45-46 among white voters. And at that point, 2 weeks out, we're like, holy moly! I mean, if these numbers hold, it could be a substantial victory.
Yeah, the biggest indicator that I was staring at was why are white Republican identifying voters frozen and not coming back?
Right. And I think we saw numbers starting to change in September, where we had looked at it back in March, April, testing issues about trust, values, those type of issues. And, I think the tagline of all our spots said we just can't trust him as governor. I forget exactly what the words were, but part of the problem in Washington, D.C., if you look at polls from the spring, David Vitter was well above water on all of those personal attributes. Shares my values, can solve problems, is trustworthy. If you ask, is he part of the problem in Washington, D.C., it was like 30-something yes, 60-something no. I mean, he was well above water on all these attributes. And then right around September, you saw his values, his trust, all those things flip upside down. And Mr. Ruckert, who was here earlier, mentioned that in the last week, his favorability numbers and the personal attribute numbers did actually improve some in the last week of the campaign. We were tracking it nightly, and we saw a bit of an uptick. But at the end of the day, in our own polling, we never had him over 52 or 53 among white voters when he really needed to be. Depending on turnout differentials and everything else, he needed to be in the upper 60s, say 68. And so, we're like, well, if we give him all the undecideds and then flip some people in the last 48 hours, I guess it's possible. But it was nerve-wracking. We were up all night, but we thought we're probably going to win the race.
Gentlemen, we're running out of time, so we're going to have to wrap it up here. I'm sure we're going to hear more from y'all in Super PACs in the coming election cycle in 2016. But thank y'all very much, Trey Orso, Joel DeGrotto, and Julia Donahue. Thank y'all for participating and explaining.
Well, Shauna, there is always a place, no matter the conversation, for critical thinking, responsible reporting, and credible journalism.
Absolutely, and it was really great to hear that firsthand account, insider knowledge about what went on behind the scenes of those campaigns.
It's great, and it's wonderful to partner with the Manship School, too.
Oh, fantastic.
Absolutely. Well, thanks to everyone for sharing their analysis on this year's historic gubernatorial election. Remember to join us live on LPB January 11th as the state swears in its 56th governor.
And get all the breaking news about the upcoming 2016 special session on Louisiana, the state we're in. You can see that every Friday night at 7 o'clock. Thanks again for watching, and have a good night.
Good night, everyone.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.